I've always been interested in charting a unique course for myself. That has been a priority for me since I was 15 years old. And this podcast is a continuation of my interest in exploring self-actualization and how we get fulfillment in different parts of our lives, throughout our lives. Tarpley Long, my guest today, she knew how to survive and thrive through every era of her life. And she just keeps going. She doesn't stop. Where some people, as they get older, they seem to become more resigned, more mentally arthritic. Others keep up a certain level of dynamism and flexibility and curiosity. They are growing and expanding instead of shrinking and limiting themselves. Welcome to Actual People, a podcast hosted by me, Chauncey Zulkin, dedicated to meaningful conversations about the evolving landscape of our lives and the power of our own creativity and imagination to make magic. In today's episode, I'm speaking to a woman that went to college with my mother, who I've always been very impressed with. Her name is Tarpley Long, and she is an award-winning psychotherapist. Her research includes over 50 articles and conference papers. She was elected to the Cosmos Club of Washington in the category of Meritorious Original Work in Addiction Medicine, and she was named Washingtonian Magazine's Top 100 Psychotherapists. She has a BA in Anthropology from Tulane, where she met my mother, an MA in Counseling Psychology, an MSW in Social Work, and postgraduate training as a psychoanalyst from the Washington Psychoanalytic Institute. And there's a lot more to unpack about her. One of the things that fascinated me was that she was from the silent generation, older than a boomer, and age never stopped her, and it still isn't stopping her. She just keeps going. She keeps adding accomplishments to her impressive resume with no self-imposed boundary as to what she can achieve in her life. Yes, she was driven by curiosity and a love of life, but as I learned, she was also driven by necessity. She had to earn a living for herself and for her children at a certain juncture in her life. She never relied on any external person or entity or authority to tell her what she could and couldn't do. Of course, we teach our kids this now, but we were the children of second-wave feminists on the edge of two eras. We were both told to be strong and independent, to vote, and to take back our power. When I was a kid, my mother would take me to National Organization for Women rallies, and she had a big ERA sticker on her car. But at the same time, we grew up on those commercials where women cleaned the house and were the heroes because they helped enable the men to have freedom. And there was no structure to support women at all. And there still really isn't, which is why losing this election is so catastrophic, because we really absolutely need that change to fit our contemporary reality. We also grew up on Disney movies and rom-coms where all we did was wait for that prince to arrive. The ideal drummed into us from a very young age was we would go to school and we would become very educated, accomplish a lot, and then eventually drop out of public life because we would meet a man and that would be our lives, the man in our life and our family. No matter what was said, either subconsciously or consciously, this was what was put forth as the direction we should follow for success. This was the right kind of life, to be a mother, to leave your job at a certain point. I'm not saying this is the only person who ever held a job or charted her own path. There's millions of women who have done this, but from my personal perspective on the sidelines as a little girl, this is what I saw. I had a mother who never worked, but called herself a feminist. I think those things are not mutually exclusive. I think you can be a feminist and not work and decide that you're going to split the labor where the husband is the one who goes and does the work and the woman stays at home. There's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. There should be no shame attached to that. But at the same time, what was markedly a departure from her belief system was that she did seem to feel that the men in her life should support her financially, beyond child support, that she shouldn't have to work, and that things should be given to her. She expected that my father, this is a quote, keep her in a Mercedes. She was very upset when I was 7, 8 years old that he had made this promise, this erroneous promise at some point in their marriage that he would always keep her in a Mercedes. And that was the phrasing, keep her in a Mercedes. So on one hand, she's being very outspoken as a feminist and taking me to a National Organization for Women rallies and has that ERA sticker on her car. And at the same time, she's been betrayed by my father because he's no longer going to keep her in a Mercedes. That was something that really stuck out in my mind from my childhood, was that lament. He promised to always keep me in a Mercedes, like an object, keeping me as a trophy in a Mercedes. And now the trophy was now going to be passed on to another woman or series of women. My mom was victim to the fantasy of the male savior that was going to come along and fix everything for her and maintain her. I do blame her for the fact that she ignored the agency that she was advocating for, but at the same time, she was working within a structure where this was etched into our consciousness. Like I said, she was stuck in the middle of these two different eras. She chose to not try to take the power back for herself. She even said to me several times growing up, I don't want to work. That's not the life for me. Which is a very convenient thing to say if you have that option. A lot of the time, I don't want to work. But she felt like she was entitled to that. And she was able to work whatever system that was. But what it signaled to me was that I wanted to make sure I was never slave to anyone or anything. The prison and the privilege, or the privilege and the prison that she was in, was something I didn't want to have any part of. That just scared me. In fact, when I used to smoke cigarettes, I would say that I had broken that promise to myself because I was slave to cigarettes. And so here I am as a young child, and I'm seeing this, her best friend from college, going out and doing all of these things and pivoting and pivoting and pivoting and getting more and more credentials and just taking complete control of her own life. I don't feel like I have been able to take complete control of my own life the way this woman has. So I wanted to sit down and talk to her and hear how she did it, and also what that experience was like for her at that time, which is a very different time from now, even though we are facing a very retrograde situation ourselves. So here she is. I bring to you Tarpley Long, psychoanalyst, mother, Clogger, playwright, professor, researcher, and a whole lot more. I wanted to interview you because I've known you since I was a child, and you have always impressed me because at a time when the life trajectory was just, go to school, go to college, get married, have kids, stay at home or stay in a company for, whatever amount of years and then retire, you were doing new things in your 30s. I was like, oh my God, she's just constantly evolving. And I want to be like that, and it's hard because the inner voice tells you, you can't do that. And it's time to stop. Or even I had a friend tell me in my 20s that I was just too old for him to photograph. I was 28 or 29, and he said, your skin is not as tight as it was. And
Oh, really?
At 28, 29, and I was a skinny little thing. So I was like, why don't you do a photo shoot with me, for, one of your artsy photo shoots? And he said, no, you're too old. And I remember being like, oh, wow, really? Yeah, it's happening. And I was 28. That sounds so ridiculous and crazy.
Well, speaking of that, at 28, I think that's how old I was when I decided to apply to medical school, not to become a psychiatrist, but just doctor. And I sent it off, and it was rejected right out because I was too old.
Really?
This is before the Bakke ruling, Bakke, the Bakke ruling in California, where you had people suing, saying, what do you mean I'm too old to go to medical school? I'm 31, I'm 32, I'll be out when I'm 40. I got a life expectancy of 75 or 80. What's your problem? Really? And so, yeah, I was told I was too old. And then there was something else I applied to. Oh, I applied. I had just gotten back from overseas, and I was fluent in Spanish at the time. So I thought, well, maybe I'll work for the police department. Nope, too old.
What age were you?
28. You can't start to be a policeman when you're 28. That may have changed now, but this was like 1971.
I've always suffered from someone says, "You can't do this." I go, "Oh, okay, I see you." We get one rejection for something, and I go, "Oh, I guess it's not good." It's like I have to fight against that. I'm getting over it, but it's constant work. And in a world where it's the norm to be kept down, how did you break free from that?
Well, I think the beginning of my career started probably when I was a little kid. And my parents were involved in community theater. And I was an only child until I was 10 because I was born before World War II and my brothers were not born until after. That's why there's this huge age differentiation. My father was overseas for years. But when I was a little kid, as soon as my dad came back from overseas and we settled in and got a home, my dad started a business. They were very involved in a community theater until I probably was 12. I thought my parents were actors. They were like movie stars. They were larger than life. They were on the stage, and I'd go backstage and watch them have their makeup on, and they go onto a stage and they appear as somebody I'd never seen before and do things. I was just enchanted by them, and I love what they did. So I became really, really interested in observing people, just minute things. I remember going with my dad one afternoon to sit across from the police department, and we brought a sandwich to look like, we were having lunch. But he was cast in a play to play a police officer. He had to have a billy club and a revolver. And he wanted to observe how they stood around, how they engaged with each other. Did they have their hand on the billy stick? Did they slouch? How did they comport themselves? That became the beginning of it. Developing a character, you have to take some part of yourself, even if it's alien to you, and just magnify it, just blow it up. If you're playing a completely despicable person, you have to love your character. And so, I started my career because I enjoyed people and I like people. I like observing people. I just like people. I majored in anthropology and then went on to graduate school in theater. It's all people. It's all people oriented, whether you're observing them in cultural anthropology or whether you're looking at them in a play or you have somebody come into your room because they're troubled and upset about something in their life. It's just having an abiding interest in people. That is fundamental to everything that I do.
Were you ambitious about your
No,
career?
No, 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 no. I was not ambitious at all. I was a Foreign Service wife. I gave cocktail parties and dinners and went to embassy receptions and mingled with embassy wives and whatever. And then I had children, and that's what I expected my life to be. And then we came back to the United States, and through a very traumatic situation, my husband became very ill overseas. We had to be medically evacuated. We came back. It was clear he was never going to be cleared to go overseas again. And suddenly we had hardly any money. So I had to find a job. Living overseas, you didn't need two incomes. As a matter of fact, overseas at that time, spouses were forbidden to work. They could not have a paid job. That was just part of the way it was. So it was desperation. I had to find a way to earn a living. I just had to. So I decided I like people. I'll go out study mental health counseling.
How did you come to that decision, mental health counseling?
It was because of the trauma I suffered as a result of my husband's illness. When he was ill, I was in the hospital having our second child. That was terrible. I had this ill husband, this newborn baby, and a 2-year-old. And everybody was helping my husband, but nobody reached out a hand and said, "How are you doing with all of this?" And I became so anxious, I felt I was jumping out of my skin. I could not hold a coffee cup without my hand trembling. So I would call the hospital where my husband was hospitalized and say, "Can somebody help me there, please? Help me." And the response I got was, "Don't interfere with your husband's treatment." And I said, "I'm not trying to interfere with my husband's treatment. I need some help myself." So I bundled up my kids, a stroller, a thing where you had your baby here, took a bus down to the Department of State and walked the hallways asking people, "Where can I find the health department?" So I found the health department. Somebody urged me around. And I said, "I'm a mess. I can't sleep. I'm anxious." They said, you definitely need help. And they immediately referred me to a psychiatrist who changed my life because it was through him that I discovered the world of what being a therapist was, because I came there as a patient. And I saw him for a couple of years intensively because I was a wreck. But things got sorted out. And at the end of that, I thought, I want to be like him. I want to do what he does because he was so helpful to me. He changed my life. And so that's how I became interested in particular, because I had my own struggle that I had to overcome.
That's really interesting. Do you think a lot of people come to the profession because they've endured some kind of a trauma and they want to help others once they get on the other side of it or have evolved through it?
I think sadly, a lot of people come to it who have not been in therapy. I don't think I could do my work if I had not had my own therapy. I can't imagine doing it.
I know it to become a psychoanalyst, you have to undergo psychoanalysis. That's correct, right?
That's correct.
But
Yeah,
not every therapist has to have therapy.
I think
Just
it, I think it is recommended. You can't force it. I think most people do, but I have colleagues who have never had one day of therapy in their life. I don't know how they're able to do their work, but you know,
did you know what kind of therapy you wanted to do? Did you know you wanted to be a psychoanalyst or you just
no, I didn't. I had to get the first job, when I got my degree, and I got it through a neighbor at a neighborhood picnic. And he told me that he knew somebody that was hiring people to work in an outpatient addiction treatment program. And he said, I'll give you the name of this person, call, and you just got your master's degree in psychology. Maybe they'll hire you. And they did. And I did intake work, and I don't know what my title was, but it wasn't therapist. I worked there for 3 or 4 years, and I wanted to do the therapeutic work.
well, how old were you when you started school to be a therapist?
I got my master's degree in psychology when I was 32. So
Okay.
I worked in that addiction treatment program. And then I was hired by somebody else who also had an addiction treatment program. It was a partial hospitalization program. Part of the deal to do that, he paid for my MSW. That reimbursed more for the treatment center. It's not reimbursable under insurance with an MA in psychology.
And it's still not.
I don't think it is. At that time, for the American Psychoanalytic Association, for you to get training as a social worker, you had to have personal interviews and everything else to see if you were up to snuff. You really did have the clinical experience of a psychiatrist. Social workers were not allowed to be trained as analysts. So I was maybe the third one who was let in. There were two people before me. So I was the third one that was allowed. Now, an LPC, MSW, anybody can get psychoanalytic training. If you apply, certain institutes, have different requirements, but the requirements are just not as rigid as they used to be. I've always had doors slammed in my face. And I think one of the things, my early success, I'll have to tell you, is my name. Because at that time in the 70s, if I made an appointment to see somebody and I said my name was Tarpley Richards, which that's what it was then, they thought I was a man. And they thought I was, Tarpley Richards' secretary calling to make an appointment to see the head of this
Oh my
company
God.
or that. So, I love walking in and seeing people try to compose themselves when they saw this is a woman. And they were clearly not expecting that.
I actually named my website Girl on the Street in my 20s because of the opposite reason. Everyone thought that I was a man.
Huh?
Because I wrote about fashion, they thought I was a gay man.
Oh,
And very specifically, they thought I was a gay Black man. So
oh,
I didn't mind the gay or the Black, but I did mind the man. So I named my website Girl on the Street because I wanted people to know I was female. Because I'd had the same experience where I would walk in and people would adjust their thinking, go, oh my God, you're a female.
yeah.
Are you still practicing? Because you retired, but you're back. Do you practice?
Yeah, I have a limited practice. I am not taking new patients, but during COVID, when everybody was on Zoom and their lives were upended, I was contacted by 3 or 4 patients who I had seen before I retired in 2015, and they contacted me and said, "Could you refer me to somebody or what?" And I wrote back and I thought, I'd be happy to see you. I don't have an office anymore, but I can certainly see you via Zoom. And so that's worked out. So I see 3 or 4 people who are old, people who I've seen before. And I do some supervision of current students who are studying to become psychoanalytic psychotherapists. So I do supervision. And I teach one course a year. And periodically, if something occurs to me that I find interesting, I'll write about it and send it off and do a conference paper or something.
So I want to talk about, just sort of to go back and talk about, I don't know, what the transition was, but you decided to pursue acting.
After I finished my psychoanalytic training, I enrolled in an acting conservatory in Washington, D.C., the Studio Theater Acting Conservatory. It's a 5-year curriculum, just like the psychoanalytic training was 5 years. So I enrolled for another 5 years studying something else, but it's not like I'm starting from scratch. I feel like I just build on top of myself, my early admiration of acting and watching my parents be actors, and then interest in people in general, and then interest in people in a depth psychological fashion. There was that. Acting to me is just psychological theory in motion, you know.
Wow. You really went for it. You weren't dabbling. I know from my mother speaking about you and telling me very proudly as your friend saying, oh, he did this and she did that. Very excited for the things that you accomplished. Tell me about your thought process, your decision making. You're winding down your practice and you lean more into the acting and the writing theater.
I finished the conservatory. I graduated from the conservatory and I was in a couple of plays locally, but I still had a full-time practice. This was 2005. I simply couldn't do it. I could not work all day and then get more energy up and go out and do a performance 5 nights a week. I just couldn't do it. I did it one time and I realized, no, I can't do this. So what I did then was I became active in a readers theater called the Cosmos Theater in Washington, which is now in its 22nd year. This little theater group specialized in doing a first staged reading of new works by playwrights. So they would submit their plays to us, and we had a committee, and we had, I don't know, 20 or 30 people, and we'd stage it, and we'd read it, we'd have music stands. I mean, stage readings can be really quite professionally well done, and I think this was. So that's what I did from like 2010, I think, until just last year. And the reason I stopped is because since COVID, I don't live in DC anymore. I live miles away from this theater. It takes me an hour and a half to 2 hours to drive in, and an hour and a half to 2 hours to drive home. And before I lived, a 15-minute walk from there. So it's just not doable. So I kind of gave that up. And that's when I started writing a few plays. I never set out to do that. This is one of these things where, I don't know if you had this experience where it just sort of downloaded right before my eyes. I could just see it, and
The whole play, you just had the story all fully baked. Yeah.
well, what it was, I reread Absalom, Absalom, and this was, I'm going to say, 2010. And as I was reading it, I thought, this book, the story could take place today. It doesn't matter that it's in Mississippi. It doesn't matter. It could take place today. So I was out for a run, and at some point I just stopped dead in my tracks, and I saw the play just in my mind's eye. I just saw it. So I came home and
Wow.
I thought, I want to write this play, and I want to use some of Faulkner's language because he's like Shakespeare, I mean,
Yes. Yeah.
it's just
Genius.
so I thought, I bet I have to contact the executor of the Faulkner estate. because he hadn't been dead 75 years or, something like that. So I got in contact with this man and he and I talked. And basically what he said was, you can do this one time. I like your idea. You can do it one time. I submitted it to the Capitol Fringe Festival, which is in Washington, D.C. every year. And it has to be a certain length. This was an hour and 10 minutes. I think it can't be any longer. And he said I could do it for the run. I could make no money. I had to make an accounting to him. So I had to use my own money, $14,000. I had to hire a director. I had a publicist, the actors and everything.
Was it called Absalom?
It's called Dark House. Dark House. And that was Faulkner's first choice of the name of Absalom. He gave it up. So I reprised his original story. So after it was done, it was actually quite successful. But at the end of that, I paid off everybody. There really was no money left over. I made an accounting to the Faulkner Foundation, and he said, thank you very much. I want to let you know you can never do this again because we recently sold the rights for all Faulkner productions, stage and screen, to the actor James Franco.
Why don't you get in touch with James Franco and see if you can make a deal with him?
I've thought about that. Dealing with some of these people, especially if they're famous or have other famous things, they're really hard people to make inroads with. I did the same thing with my second play, which was Shirley Jackson. I decided some of her little short stories would make wonderful staged reading vignettes. So I pulled that together. Here it is. I don't know that you can read it or not.
Finding humor in the ominous.
Yeah.
Can we read Dark House, or is it just not even, you're not allowed to have anyone read it? How does that, I would like to see these things.
It had to be totally gone. I could not keep any part of it. And the same thing happened with this. Shirley Jackson's oldest son is the executor of her estate. And I talked with him. And again, I would think, why wouldn't you want the world to know what your mother said? She was such a brilliant writer. She is so funny and so dark.
Yeah.
And people love her. Why wouldn't this be wonderful publicity? Nope, he didn't want me to do it. He said, you can do it this one time for this one stage reading. And then that's it. No more. Over and out.
So you need to write something original, completely original.
I did. The play that I wrote last, which was in 2022, I had a cast. I had a place where it was going to be staged. I'd had numerous readers, and they loved the play. They loved it. But I'll tell you why it's not there. We had our first rehearsal scheduled for the day after the Uvalde shootings in Texas.
Wow. Okay.
And this is a story. It's a comedy, a dark comedy. And it's really about me and my murderous rage at the historic review board where my house is located, and how the pains that you have to go through to get anything through the historic review board. And people thought it was hilarious, but I become this crazed 85-year-old woman who decides that, she's going to learn how to shoot an AK-17. And so I go to the firing range. I had a wonderful name for the firing range, Bubba's Bullets. So I would go to Bubba's Bullets and take my lessons. I learned how to make homemade Molotov cocktails by looking online. The play is about...
It's a mass shooting, a comedy about a mass shooting.
Comedy about a mass shooting, yeah.
Oh, no.
And,
no. Has anybody ever made a movie that was, like the falling down, or there's some...
That's it. I was just going to say, falling down. That's where I got the idea. Remember? The driver goes into McDonald's and he wants a sausage biscuit, and it's 10:15 in the morning, and they say, we don't sell them after 10 o'clock. And he said, but one's just sitting right there. Can't I just have it? No, you can't. I can't sell it to you. And he became so enraged, he went out to his truck and brought back a Gatling gun and just blew the whole place to smithereens. I understood that. I understood that.
But it's a different time culturally. I had a boy that I tutored that was in sixth grade when I was a sophomore. He loved rap. And he's like, I'm gonna kill people that are so mean to me. I was tutoring him and helping acclimate him into the classroom, and I just adored him. He was a good kid. So I said, no, well, you're not going to actually do that. Hip hop will help you process these emotions, but the difference between you and the lyrics of that song is that you're not going to actually do it. This was before Columbine, before any of the school shootings. It never occurred to me that a few years after that, I would have had to report this kid because
Sure.
that's a threat. But
Yeah.
it wasn't a threat in this particular case. He was just posturing and being a pubescent boy who was frustrated, but actually a really sweet kid. There was no precedent for this, but I always think back that, it's just a different time.
No, 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 no. So I tabled that, but I think it's a good play. And
Thelma and Louise has that kind of a theme.
the Coen brothers do. It's dark comedy. You
Yeah. I love dark comedies and I love playing with darkness. There's a fine line where this is not palatable, this is upsetting. I haven't been able to define what that is. I love David Lynch. I love when there's some sense of fantastical or otherworldliness. But not only that, I love In Cold Blood because it's a character study.
It absolutely is. I learned something important in my first field placement as a social worker. I was placed in the DC jail. And I was in an interview room, and somebody came in the night before. This guy had been in a bar. He was, of course, drunk, and somebody did something that he didn't like. He didn't like the way the guy was looking at his girlfriend. So he crashed the beer bottle on the side and went over and lunged the guy, in the throat with this cutoff thing. And so, he was obviously arrested and put in jail. And what I learned from this psychiatrist was what happens there is that there's no delay between imagining something and having it just full blown go into action. There's nothing wrong with imagining what it would be like to cut somebody's throat. That's just private in your mind, but it's a long way from cutting somebody's throat. It has to do with your ability to fantasize and have that be some kind of a release from the kind of tension. So I watched him talk this man through it. He said, if you crash that, what's going to happen next? And he said, well, I'm going to go for the guy. And he said, and then what's going to happen? And he said, well, then I'm going to stab him. And he said, and then what's going to happen then? Guy said, I don't know. I guess I'll leave. And then what do you think is going to happen? I don't know. Maybe I'll just go. Oh, you don't think you're going to be arrested? You don't think somebody would call? Yeah, I guess. It's just like being able to follow it through and realize you can't do this.
I remember going to your house once. I'm like, I almost feel like you weren't there. My mother and I went to your house, and maybe you were there. It was in Chevy Chase. There was a movie that you liked, and we rented it. And it was back when you would rent a videotape. And I want to say Blood Simple. Is that one of your favorite movies?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I must have been in high school, and I don't think I liked it. I think it scared me or freaked me out or something. I was like, he likes this? I have to go back and watch it. Was it a Coen Brothers movie?
Absolutely.
Oh my God. I love
Yeah.
the Coen Brothers, but I must have been, 17 or something. I think it was actually on our drive up to go look at schools. That makes sense. Like we stopped in DC and saw you, and I went up to look at Bard and Sarah Lawrence and Bennington, and we saw Blood Simple at your house.
Uh-huh.
I think it's a good segue. I was looking at the papers that you've written, and 3 of them stood out that I wanted to talk about in light of the current cultural moment that we're in right now,
Sure.
and a couple of topics that really are important to me, one of which is creativity and imagination. What do you think the relationship is between mental health and creativity? Can you be mentally stable and healthy and tap into your full creativity? What are your thoughts on that?
I have one phrase for that. Don't drop your structure. I had a neighbor once who wrote for a newspaper. She worked on deadline because you have to do that. And she took a year off to write a book. And after about 3 months, she just was making no headway. I saw her once taking out the garbage or something. And I said, "How's it going?" And she said, "Just not well." She said, "A friend of mine suggested I join this writers group." So I did. She called me when she came back and she said, they listened to my story. And one of them said, "First of all, get up and get dressed. You have a job here." She was just waking up whenever because she didn't have a deadline. She'd stumble in, get a coffee, go back to bed. Maybe at noon, she'd go take her dogs for the walk in sweats, and come back and then have a little nap. And she just dropped her structure. I think if you have a structure, like you mentioned David Lynch earlier, obviously he's a very creative and people would say kind of wild and woolly guy, right? As a human being, but he has a structure. He works, he gets up every day and he builds something. He gets up at the same time, he has lunch, he has dinner, and he does these things. You have to keep yourself pulled together because when people are mad, they're anti-structure. They don't have any structure at all. It's just totally fallen apart. You can have all kinds of neuroses and personality problems, but if you harness your creativity in a structured way, it's the process of it. It's not the destination, it's the journey. To me, that's the fun of anything creative, is the process of doing it, not the end result. If you're focused on, oh, I can't wait for the win, I think you miss out on the important, really gratifying building blocks of developing a competency in almost anything. You're nodding. Do you agree with me?
I completely agree with you. I'm thinking about a book that changed my life and the way I take art more seriously. When I was writing the first book I wrote, Rock Underwater, I was in the south of France and I read The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield. He has another book called Turning Pro. The theme of both of these books is to take yourself seriously and do the fucking work. If you're a welder, or lawyer, or doctor, it's the same thing. Being a creative person, it's a body of work. You're not a dilettante. You're not playing. Yeah,
Exactly.
it's your job. And yeah, get dressed. You have to be at your desk, butts in seats, whatever you're doing, you have to be a professional about it.
Yeah,
So
that's right.
these are people who are literally creating the world that we live in. Landscape design or city planning or writing a movie or writing a book, all of this is all about structure, all about creating order out of chaos. Yeah.
Yeah. I fear that we've become, as a nation, maybe a world, so much more passive than we were 50 years ago, with just having everything come to you. You just flip on your phone and you're entertained. You don't have to do anything. You're passive. And people are becoming more depressed. I mean, there are more symptoms of anxiety and depression. It's just gone up exponentially. Active engagement in skill development is a natural antidepressant. I believe that with my heart.
This is not even just skill. This is something that came to mind. When I'm washing dishes or doing some sort of mundane thing, sometimes I notice I'm smiling, almost like in a stupid way, doing the dishes or putting things away. I got like a flow going.
Yeah,
If I can get into the zone of doing anything, I'm weirdly content. I'm like, why am I smiling like an idiot right now? The anxiety or feeling of restlessness or fear comes when I don't know what I'm doing and I'm kind of in between things. And also from scrolling on the phone. I had another guest on the podcast for every minute of every day she was on social media. That was her job. She was diagnosed with digital dementia. I find myself, even if I don't want to at all, looking at something sometimes between very important tasks. That makes me feel anxious. So I don't go, oh, I can't wait to go wash dishes. But in the middle of the task, that's what's interesting about it. Anything that I'm actually doing, I
yeah.
enjoy.
That's the whole Montessori school philosophy. Did you or your sister or any of your kids go to
I went
Montessori?
to Montessori all the way up through third grade. And so did Morgan, my sister. And my kids went to Reggio schools, not Montessori, but they're child led, experiential, and very physical. My kids didn't even look at screens until they were 2, and they have iPads. But my kids like to be outside, especially Sky likes to be outside. She just wants to be on her bike or skateboard outside. I'm very lucky. I hope it continues.
Oh, yeah, I do too. I mean, what you were describing about taking pleasure and smiling and doing the dishes, it's a small task, but it's the accomplishment of tasks that I think gives a sense of completion and mastery. When you're a 3-year-old and you do it, you feel so proud of yourself. You know,
Yeah.
it's soul affirming that you can do something, you know?
Right. But I feel like a lot of life is very vague now. And because it is so passive. The phone in the beginning was like, oh, that's so cool. You can see all this stuff right on your phone. But then it became your whole life seeing stuff on your phone. And that's clearly not okay. The other things you have written about that I wanted to just sort of touch on was the last one was film, fantasy, and fairy tales. Is there a way to incorporate fantasy or a playfulness that you think could create satisfaction? Can fantasy create more reality for people, more of a sense of reality?
I think all three of those, film, fantasy, and fairy tales, they're all stories. And, everybody loves stories. What's the story? Little kids, they want to have the same story read over and over and over and over again. If you skip a word, do you remember that? You're reading this and you skip a couple of words. No, no, mommy, no, you didn't read the whole thing. Then
Yeah.
there's something that is so compelling about stories that I think is healing. And there has to be a love story somewhere in it, or it doesn't work.
And
There
it can be
has,
a friendship love. It can be a love of what you do. It can be a
yes,
love of yourself. More often, it's not a romantic love. I notice in Pixar movies, it's loving yourself, loving your sister, like Frozen, loving your independence, loving your parents.
right. Loving your neighbor is yourself, which is fundamental to virtually every religion in the world. All of them boil down to love your neighbor as yourself. And that seems to be the hardest thing that human beings are able to do.
And to remind themselves that we are all the same. That's so hard for us. If we think that every one of our experiences are so unique and they're not, why are we wired to feel that we are so different? Is there something in psychology that answers that question?
Well, I think we're wired to initially develop a sense of self.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you'd never differentiate and you'd never be a person. So when you see yourself as separate from your sister or your brother, when you see yourself as separate, it's not that you would feel superior. It's just that I'm different. I'm myself. I am me. But then I think you realize that you need your relationships with other people in order really to be a happy person. Um,
Yeah.
Relationships are just essential to people being happy. And virtually everything I do involves other people. Even if you're writing a story, which I loved my characters when I was writing my play, for
Even if
example.
the people are imaginary.
Yeah, yeah. They're imaginary, but I make them into people.
In
But
the
you know,
profession that you are in, when you're a therapist, you are not working with a lot of other people most of the time. If you're in private practice, you have to consciously decide to go out and find people and surround yourself with. Profession is pretty solitary. Or
it's a very solitary one, and I learned very early in my work to I always had to be in a study group with other people. My practice, it was solitary, but I was in an office with 3 other therapists, and we were together for 44 years. I think one left, but the rest of us were there for 44 years. So, we would consult with each other about things that we were having difficulty with, or if we were upset about a particular session or whatever. I teach something called task, role, and boundary for beginning therapists.
wait. Task, role, and boundary?
Role, task, and boundary.
Role,
Role,
task, and boundary.
what is
Okay.
the role? What is the work to be done? And what is the frame? We call it the frame. What is the frame in which this work gets done? And what happens when that frame is broken? It would be a boundary crossing or violation. And one of the things that we preach, I have a co-teacher, is that our work is so isolating. You have to make sure that you do not become isolated, because if you are, that's when therapists get into trouble. They start taking their patients as their friends. Your patients are not your friends. Please go out and make your own.
One of my children saw my therapist with me. My therapist made an exception. She doesn't want to obviously take on my child as her patient, but
Uh-huh.
she was having a challenge and she wanted to speak to someone. So she saw my therapist But now my child refers to my therapist as my friend, and I have to explain to her that that's not my friend. I just said, told my therapist something. She thought it was really funny. It's something that I had shared with my kids. And it was funny how a child can't understand that. It feels almost hostile to a child that you wouldn't be friends with everyone you meet,
Yeah, right.
but you have to have that boundary. So the last thing is just about aging. I'm thinking about going back to get another degree, making some pivots in my career. And a lot of people are doing that. I'm not alone. It happens many more times in a career than it used to, or in a lifetime, that you have different selves and different lives, different eras. I think one of the problems is fear that you failed if you have to change, or fear that you will fail.
The first thing I would say to anybody who was thinking about leaving their career is, what are you going to do next? Maybe you're not going to have another career, but what are you going to do? If you're letting go with this trapeze, you better grab onto the next one. Otherwise, you're going to fall. I retired because there was something I wanted to go toward.
Yeah.
I couldn't do it in my current practice because I wanted to travel extensively before I got too old to be able to travel by myself and do all the things I wanted to do. So I retired because I had plans for the next 3 years, trips. I was going to be gone. And I couldn't keep a practice and do that. People said to me, well, why don't you just cut back? Well, to me, that's, I have to be all in.
It sounds like middling. You are able to make a decisive
Yeah.
decision, and then so sorry, I'm kind of cutting you off, but do you write in the morning, or how do you know what you want? It's like, how do you process different things that are going? I find if I write a lot, I go, "Oh my God, of course it's all pointing to this thing," but it takes a while. And if I don't do that, I sit in this middling nothingness where I'm like this whole year, marketing's changing, AI is happening, jobs, and I'm like, I don't know for so long. How do you make sharper pivots?
I don't know. I'm not sure I could navigate the world right now if I had to come up with something other than what I'm already doing. I just continue to build on what I've already had and just elaborate on it. It just goes in a little different direction, but it's all people oriented and goal oriented. I have things that I want to accomplish. It took me a long time to retire. I'd say 5 years, because I kept an apartment in Washington, even though I moved to Ellicott City, because I was unwilling to let go of that. But I'd go down to DC and I'd sit in this little apartment on the weekend and see people for dinner or whatever. And all I could think of was, this isn't my life anymore. I need to get back to my life. So I gave up that apartment gratefully right before COVID. So I didn't have to pay for another year of renting this expensive apartment in DC. But when I retired, I did all of that travel from 2015 to February of 2020. And then for a year, since I live in the country, I really wasn't that inconvenienced about COVID because the population density is low here. But my job then was to take my grandson to one of the few schools that was open because my daughter refused to have him sit at home by himself. So there was a school open and I took him. I did the transportation a lot for that. So that became, that was my mission. But I'd meet up with friends and we'd go for walks. It was during that time that I also decided to do a renovation on my house, and that had to deal with the Historic Review Board. So that's why I ended up writing that play. So, one thing kind of led to another. That was such an awful experience. I had to just do something to somehow corral it into something that I could tolerate looking at. And that was to laugh at it every day as I typed my dialogue.
I think that you're just like a creative person, and you're an intellectually engaged person. So stuff happens for you because you stay at it. If there's things that help you stay on course with that structure, I'd love to
Oh,
hear them.
I tell you, the first thing is I keep a daily calendar. I write down just as if I were employed and had a patient hour. I structure my day. I have things programmed every day, including when I do my dance practice. Because quite frankly, Chauncey, if it wasn't in my schedule, I wouldn't do it. I mean, I'm no paragon, look at her. She does this, that, and the other. I follow my schedule, and not in a slavish way. It gives me pleasure to look back on the day and say, I did all of these things. It's just,
Yeah.
it's a sense, it's just an expanded version of washing the dishes. as you
Right, I
say.
know, right. It's true. I always start my day writing. It's good to stay engaged and don't just wander through life.
Yeah, I mean, I even have, it's almost embarrassing to say this. It's like I say, I still use WordStar or something. I mean,
I
I'm
don't even know what
old.
that is.
Well, it's way before
Microsoft Word?
this early, like 1980 software program.
Okay.
But I use the week at a glance calendar, the one that is paper. They still sell it at Staples. And I have that. I keep a paper calendar. I don't use my phone because I know me. I won't look at it. I have to have my calendar there so I can't escape it. Let me see. Let me see. Hold
See,
it up.
this is one I have. It's a really good one. I should send you the link to it. This is how I was planning on moving back to the Northeast years ago, and then I never moved. If people don't have this thing inside that pushes them forward, they need some external things to help them along the way because life can be long, hopefully. And I wanted to look to you for when you get that sinking feeling of what am I doing again? What's the point of this or that? You're somebody who seems you're always moving forward. You're never languishing in a moment and feeling sorry for yourself. You just, and I,
No, that's true. I'm not. One thing I was going to say is that the activities I've done since I have retired are all physical activities, power training classes. I have Zumba and tap and clogging. All of those are group activities. And there is something to be said for motivation and pleasure in being in a group of people learning something new. Everybody's struggling with it. We encourage each other. And I think that kind of engagement is now actually in all the, I hate to call them old folks homes. I don't know what you call them, but assisted.
assisted living.
Right. It used to be you'd put your relative there and they just sit there all day long. Now they've got things happening constantly. They'll come to your room and say, it's time to go and paint. Otherwise, people would just sit in their rooms. You have to make sure that you remain engaged, not only in what you're doing, but with other people engaged in the same thing.
Can you just quickly tell the story of how you started clogging? Because I can't really end this without hearing that. I want to share that with whoever's listening. Talk about the clogging thing.
Okay, well, as soon as I could, maybe early 22, I started taking tap again. And one day in the tap class, somebody said, oh, stay, there's this clogging exhibition from the Carroll County Cloggers. So I decided to stay and watch. And I watched and I said, I want to do that. I want to do that. I was 80 years old. I said, I am going to do that. So they passed around a note saying they were having a beginning class starting in the fall. So I did that in the fall of 22, and I've taken them ever since. There are 3 or 4 people. We have a carpool. It's a long journey. It's hard. It's like tap, but I absolutely love it. But again, I have people, it's a group effort. And so that's how I came to it. I saw something and I thought, I want to do that. I'm determined to do that. I don't know how much, I mean, I can still do it, which is, I'm grateful for that my feet and body still work. It's hard. It's not just moving your feet. You have to memorize choreography, which is very difficult. So it's a mental workout.
You showed me the sheet. It's numerical. It feels like reading music.
Exactly.
But do you ever get depressed or feel despondent? I think what people suffer from is a sense of losing their passion, and you don't do that.
No, I fight that. The only time I feel really despondent is, like uh, dental work. I have to have a bridge replaced and lose another tooth. And I mean, I get down about the fact that I'm probably going to outlive my teeth. And that does not make me happy.
You always kind of have a sense of what you want to do, but I think it maybe comes down to you just staying engaged and listening to yourself and being aware of how you feel.
Yes.
Would that be right?
Yeah,
Any
that would be right.
anything
And
else you want to add to that?
when my second husband died in 2020, he was buried at Arlington Cemetery. So there's a place that I can be buried. And my daughters and my stepdaughters, I've been getting things ready when I eventually die. So I have a folder and everything. They said, what would you like put on your tombstone? They came up with this for me, forever curious.
Yeah.
It's about being a kid forever. And, there's always something new to learn. And, oh, look at this.
Yeah.
And I don't know what happens that for many people, they lose that sense of excitement over, wow, this is something I want to know how to do this.
I feel like I'm getting more excited. Also, having kids doesn't hurt because they're excited about stuff. I get into it with them and heal my child wounds with my kids and do the fun things that they like to do. I don't care what people think of me anymore. That's also part of it, losing all the baggage and worry to just not let things complicate your joy and curiosity about stuff.
Yeah, I
Anyway.
also remember my parents had absolutely no tolerance for me saying, oh, I don't know what to do. Well, I think I'll find something to do.
Yeah. Yeah. My mom used to say, if you're bored, it means you're boring, which was a little bit of a taunt, but I was like, okay, I'll figure something out then. But anyway, we're running out of time. We've had a long conversation.
Yeah, we have, and I really enjoyed it. I hope it was interesting to you.
It's so interesting. I really admire you. This has been a real privilege. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Actual People. This show is written, directed, and executive produced by me, your host, Chauncey Zalkin. Show sound designed by Eric Aaron. Click on the link below to subscribe so you don't miss a single episode. And don't forget to leave a review. I'll be sharing my favorites. You can find our socials and all links to deeper dives into these topics at chaunceyzalkin.com and on my Substack at chaunceyzalkin.substack.com. Actual People is available wherever you get your podcasts.